Hey everybody, my name is Ariel Weil. I'm the Director of Products for Yoda. And Yoda is a web and mobile optimization company. So we actually run a SaaS service that does basically in-flight optimizations for web and mobile businesses. Today we're going to talk about some image optimization techniques, some ways that we know that it impacts business, just to kind of frame why it's so important to pay attention to this topic, and then also some tools and some things that you can use to sort of help you through optimizing the images on your site for performance. So, one thing that I think everybody in this room realizes is the almost astronomical growth in mobile device and mobile computing, but almost more importantly, how that's been impacted by the way that websites and web pages have been changing over time. So if you look at sort of the 99s, the 2000s, when there was the big initial bubble and boom of the internet, people had very simple sites almost by necessity, or not almost, it was by necessity. You couldn't load the kinds of pages that people are loading today on the networks that were available back then, on the bandwidths that were made available to homes, and on the processing power that was available to people in their homes. Today, we're looking at a very different story. Now, based on the data that Yoda's collected, and we are not a representative sample of all of the biggest and most widespread infrastructures in the world, but the average web page is getting to be about 1.2 megabyte in size, about 200 kilobyte of JavaScript. It's hitting about 40 content domains in order to load up all the content on the site, and the average load time, despite all the best practices and what users expect and what people are seeing in the field and what Steve Souders is espousing, what we see with our customer base is the average time is around 7.5 to 8 seconds for time to finish rendering a page. Now, you take that and you layer in our customers are predominantly e-commerce customers. So we're talking about e-commerce and mobile commerce businesses. We have 500 million m-commerce shoppers by 2016, that's the projection. Actually, we're looking like we're trending towards a figure that's going to be at least about 5 to 10% higher than that at this point. 71% of smartphone users actually shop on their mobile devices. Now that's relatively a high number from what most people would expect, but I think some of the context that needs to be layered in when we start talking about something like this figure and like what this actually means to web developers and web performance optimization folks is when people are browsing a mobile commerce site, think about what they're actually doing. They're on a mobile site, a mobile phone, sure. But what are they actually browsing? What do you browse when you go to the sites that you care about? If you go to Amazon, or you go to Etsy, or you go to any other site that you can think of that you typically would shop at, are you browsing the mobile site? Are you browsing the full site? Is it a responsive full site? Is it an adaptive full site? Are you going through an app? How are you actually consuming the data that the company is making available to you? What we see is, again, not surprisingly, the number of people who are shopping for mobile devices has gone up. The number of people who buy are buying faster and more frequently from tablet devices, it seems, than from mobile devices, which is almost good news for the web developer and for the guys that are working on delivering the most optimal page performance to their end users, because the tablet gives you something a little bit closer to the horsepower and the sort of landscape that you're going to get on a desktop solution. Mobile forces you through a lot more pigeonholes and to overcome a lot more challenges. Now when you look at the average smartphone revenue per session, that is climbing. People are getting more comfortable buying things on mobile phones. But are they buying them from mobile sites? And the fact is, when you look at some of the numbers that Steve Souders has put together that we're finding from our own customers, it actually seems like anywhere between 20 to 50% of the time spent shopping on a commerce site from a mobile device is actually on the full site. When you make the full site available, Steve Souders found himself that about 35% of customers will go to the full site when they have the option available to them. Google, conversely, has started penalizing companies when they've tried to phone in their mobile solution, no pun intended, or a really bad joke intended. When you go to a mobile site that has 10 to 20% of the content on your full site, think about what you're telling your customer. Either you understand what they want to do, and you understand that very, very well, or you're telling them, I know you're coming to me on your mobile device, I have Google Analytics, I saw it, I just frankly don't have the resources, or I don't care. So download my mobile app, or go to the m.site, which always takes you to the home page of the website. Well, Google has made quite a bit of noise and created quite a stir in the industry by saying that that's going to start costing you as far as SEO is concerned, and well, it should. Some of the latest updates, and we can go into that afterwards, or I can send you guys links if you want to see. We've got full presentations on sort of the latest rules from Google, but it's not okay anymore for you to sacrifice your user's experience on a mobile device just because it was an easier way for you to get a mobile site built. So some statistics. 1 in 5 electronic purchases were actually made on a mobile phone. 35% of mobile visitors would prefer to go to your full site. 80% of the mobile revenue is actually coming from purchases made on the full site. So the actual statistic that I saw here was for every $7, it's a weird number, for every $7 of mobile commerce revenue, $5.50 of that was coming from a full website visit and from a full website purchase. $1 of that is coming from an m.site purchase, 50 cents of that is coming from an application. Yes?
Does it discount the content that's bought, or is it only for like real shopping, like retail shopping, or does it include the content shopping like music and video, which would anyway would have to happen on mobile?
It's talking about any company that identifies as an e-commerce company that took part in the study. So is it comprehensive? Not really, but it's a decent representative set up. So some other statistics. 71% of smartphone users shop via mobile, we know that. 48% of all retail transactions is something that surprised us. We went and tried to vet that and actually found that for our mobile commerce customers, that is where they're seeing the majority of their traffic. $1 billion in apparel and accessories was done in mobile in Q1 alone this year. That's a pretty staggering figure when you think about it, especially when you think about something that's as hard to buy as apparel on a device as small as a mobile device. 64% of smartphone users expect a page to load in 4 seconds. Now what we see in our site, in our customer base, is that the average page load time on a desktop site is 7.5 to 8 seconds. On a mobile site, it's closer to 12. People are not realizing just how much harder it is to download the same content and render it on a mobile device, especially when you don't have full bars, especially when you're switching networks, especially when you have other applications running. And we can talk about some tools that you might use, and we might even get some feedback from Marlon back there so we can get a little bit more context on this. But the interesting thing is what happens when a user has a bad experience on your site. And I think that most of you guys have probably heard this, but just in case you haven't, take the extreme example. 42% of your users will go to a competitor if they're having trouble checking out from your website. 29% of those users will not return. Another 29% of those users will wait a year before they give you another chance. So if you think about what that means to your customer retention, to your monthly recurring revenue, to the amount of click-throughs that you get, to the advertising revenue that maybe you're dependent upon, or maybe how your performance metrics are gauged at your company, having a user leave you for a year after having a bad experience, especially when there's so many things in your web page, in the average web page, that you really can't control, and I'll say that in air quotes, because you can control just about everything. But when you have a regular page that you take and move to a mobile device, suddenly there are factors that simply come together differently than they would on a desktop device. Think about some of these. So the frustration that you see, I ride the train every day, I travel a lot for work, I'm always in airports. I see these faces constantly. Always have somebody that's slamming the phone, that's looking for a signal, that's shaking it so that it'll do something, hitting back button really aggressively. 41% of people are materially concerned about security, we get it. That's supposed to be the next big market. People are assuming that that's going to explode like the CDN market's exploded. It very well may. But 51% of people say that it's hard to navigate a site on a mobile device. Now why is that? Take the most obvious example. Take your normal desktop site, don't apply any responsive web design techniques, don't apply special CSS or JavaScript, and load that site on a mobile device. Now try to navigate it. I've got a screenshot later on. See what happens when you go to CNN.com on your mobile phone. Try to find a world story. Try to find the world menu item without clicking on something first, and then try to actually go into a story that you care about. Now conversely, go to Time.com. Time actually took the time to build a responsive site. When you go to their website, you get a single column of well-organized information. If you go to a tablet site, you can start expanding that into more columns. That's the way that it should work. It was a major undertaking for them, and they don't hide it. But when you look at the end result, and you look at the users who are actually going to their sites, when we talk to those companies, they are getting more sticky traffic in Time than they are in CNN, but they have more budget in CNN. They're not as worried about it. They're just throwing people at the problem. 46% of people say that product images are too small. That's not surprising, again, if you take your average site and you just shrink the entire thing by 80%. You're going to end up with really small images. And 26% feel that checkout is frustrating. I think that that can be probably a consistent figure for any real website. I mean, if you talk to people about e-commerce checkout, nobody really enjoys it. So let's talk about the boogeyman. Slow web performance directly impacts conversions. That's actually true. What we're seeing, so Amazon has the famous figure, right? For every extra millisecond of latency, for every second of latency, Target has one, Walmart has one, a lot of these companies have one. None of us are those companies. But what you do see is that customers will, while a page is refreshing, and think about a mobile device and the amount of feedback that you get. Think about what it looks like when you load a site in a regular browser like Chrome on your desktop and load Chrome on your Android device. Do you see the same spinning hockey puck? Do you see the progress bar in the tabs at the top? Do you see any other feedback mechanisms, progress bars, etc.? Now you will see in some cases when you go onto like Safari and Chrome, they'll have a little spark line at the top that's supposed to show you something that approximates a progress bar, except how often is it just sat there on the left-hand side of the screen and never moved? And you have no idea what's going on in your mobile device. The feedback simply isn't there. Steve Souders, again, has a fantastic blog, or set of blogs, I don't recall, that actually go into detail on the amount of feedback that you get from a mobile device, so developers think about it, because it's not necessarily something that you think about when you're developing a mobile site. You think about development in general. You don't necessarily think about, do I suddenly have less rotating icons and phase change pointers and things like that, but you do. Web pages are growing. So I mentioned these before. By 2015, people are assuming that pages are going to be over 2 megabytes in size. It wouldn't surprise anybody if we actually reach that point, unless, of course, some of the standards that we're trying to push through actually take effect. But this is really the most important one. Mobile devices and networks are less powerful and render more slowly. Again, the guys at Marlin probably have tons more data on this than I do. But if you've ever traveled to a place like Portland, all the other jokes about Portland aside, they have fantastic coffee, but you cannot get a cell signal to save your life. Try to load your website there. So what we actually do while we are all traveling is we'll navigate to our site, we'll navigate to our app, and we'll start taking screenshots to send to developers so that they can understand it. We offer monitoring through our service. It's synthetic. It's not the same as getting out there in the field and actually seeing what it's going to look like to try to run your Verizon phone in New York City, or to run your AT&T phone in Portland, or to try to run any phone in San Francisco. It's difficult, and you're going to have sometimes surprising results about what loads, what doesn't, in what order, how your browser renders things. Mobile sites are slower because the network connection is shaky. Think about what it means to say that I have 3G, 4G, or LTE connectivity. Think about saying it here and actually measuring what you get. Go on the speed test when your phone tells you that you're on 4G LTE, and then try to go over to Asia and find out what your phone would actually tell you, assuming that it would work, over in Asia when you have the same LTE covered speeds. Their networks fly, ours crawl. We have marketing nomenclature, they have real benchmarks that they measure against. We can't say the same things, but it's a challenge here in the States, mostly because of the variability of it. People aren't used to yet thinking about what it means when you start downloading content and you lose your connection, or you have a degrading connection, or any number of impacts like that. Like I get onto the train when I go home, for example, and I try to connect to the Wi-Fi. Does anybody else take the MBTA, the commuter route? I'm sorry. So it sucks. You can't get anything done. You try to connect to their Wi-Fi, and between I get on at South Station, I get off at West Roxbury, I have to reconnect to Wi-Fi 6 times. I can't load anything in that amount of time, so I build PowerPoints while I'm on the train. Everything is highly variable. I think that's really the point of mobile that really catches people off guard the most often. But there's one more thing that's really important. Users think that your site is 15% slower than it really is. That's a painful metric. If you think about the budget that you have to load content onto your site and what users are expecting, if users expect content in 4 seconds and your site loads in 4 seconds, they're not going to believe that it was in 4 seconds. They're going to think that it was 5 or 6. This is actually something that hilariously was backed up recently. I think it was either 48 Hours or Dateline where they did something and they interviewed a whole bunch of people in different high-stress professions, and there was only one profession that actually figured out to the second how much time they were supposed to be counting off. Can you think of one profession that would know exactly how much time is going by?
Medical.
Nope, they were actually the worst. It was rodeo riders. Think about it, with 8 seconds, they knew 8 seconds. Those guys opened their eyes and shot their heads up, and they said, this has been 8 seconds, and they were right every single time. It was absolutely amazing. Your customers are not rodeo clowns, they're not rodeo riders. They will not know how much time has gone past. You can actually see. This is something that we've gotten from a Radware study that was done, but you can see the amount of fall off by landing page speed. So the blue one is all users and the green one is mobile users. Mobile users are more tolerant because there's an assumption that there will be some latency there. There's an assumption that there's some sort of just general sort of sludginess on my phone for whatever reason. It doesn't respond like my desktop site does. But people still don't have much patience for slow sites, and I think that that is amply clear. We can show it again. This is all Yoda data, so this is from our own customer base. But you think about things that make sites larger. It's not necessarily just mobile sites, but it does impact mobile more for a lot of the reasons that we've talked about. Look at the amount of JavaScript that gets loaded on the page. So this is less than 300K, and all the way at the opposite extreme, it's going up to 1.8. megabyte. So if you look at the amount of time that it takes to load a site, and then we look at the number of round trips and the amount of time it takes to load a site, it's almost inverse to the amount of time that people will wait for your landing pages to load. You can see a direct correlation between the two metrics. And we could see a correlation when we ran a case study with one of our customers. So Big Train is actually a significant retailer, but they had 1.4 megabyte pages. They were the heaviest 20% of sites on the web. And basically it was just content curation for a product catalog. So they were showing a lot of high resolution images for everything that they were trying to sell on their site. Their developers really didn't know too much about creating lossy and lossless images or trying to have, slight content degradation. They were creating beautiful images, and they said browsers know how to resize, and we don't think it's going to be a problem. So all of their images were optimized to be 300 by 300, and then they let the browser shape them to whatever size they were supposed to be displayed. That way they could have the same thumbnail as they had product image was their justification, and their developers wouldn't have to maintain as much content. So what we saw was by reducing their requests, by creating sprite files, by minifying code and then inlining it, we were able to give them 53% faster page loads. But it increased traffic 100% because they'd never managed to convert off their mobile site and didn't understand why. And so suddenly they opened up a new revenue stream on mobile because users could actually get the pages to load and make it through to the shopping cart so that they could complete a transaction. So the long story short is that when we look at picking our battles and prioritizing what we need to fix on a web page, there are all sorts of things you can fix. You can worry about parallelizing your code. You can worry about domain sharding. You can minify your code. You can inline your scripts. You can do a lot of other things to it, but when you look at the majority of the content that you're pushing through, it's going to be JavaScript and images for most of the websites out there. And we'll give you one more example. So this is a company, I had to have a ridiculous background because it's sort of a ridiculous use case to show, but Walleye Direct makes frozen fish fillets. It's actually a big business, believe it or not. So they were looking to increase their traffic and conversions. We were able to accelerate their page rendering to get them 30% more conversions. We changed their page rendering time by 7%. It wasn't huge, but it made that immediate difference that we could track both through Salesforce and goal attainment and Google Analytics. And they were as amazed as we were because it was such what we thought a small improvement, but it was a material improvement to their customers and it showed immediately in conversions. So high-level sort of product management stuff aside now, let's actually talk about how you get to the bottom of what you want to do with your images. The one thing that you definitely need to do before you start any initiative, and hopefully there's people in the company who are doing this, sort of at every level, trying to understand what makes the most sense to prioritize, but you need to understand where your users are coming from, what their devices are, what their experiences are, and what your actual goals are for your users and for your site and for your business. So, for example, if I looked at Google Analytics, let's just say that that's what everybody in this room is using to try to track their user traffic on their website, and I see that 90% of my visitors are coming from desktop sites and iOS devices, I am not going to run around and do optimizations for Windows mobile phones. It doesn't make any sense. I could try to go out and find a solution that's going to work for me for every single mobile solution on the market, but why would I bother spending all that time? There are over 200 combinations of mobile devices and mobile browsers in play today. If I were to build a native app for iOS and Android, I would have to worry about maybe just under 40 permutations. If I were to create an HTML5 app and not focus so much on the full breadth of actually physically supporting every permutation, but just having general support so that my page loads and looks decent, now I'm worried about maybe, 10 scenarios? I'm gradually trimming what I actually have to focus on. And the same thing's true of your demographic and where your users are coming from. If I have the majority of my traffic coming from North America, I might not have to worry about some things like Anycast DNS that can be global, global CDN, load balancing globally, all of those sorts of features that sound fantastic, and a lot of people offer them. Akamai offers them, we offer them, Cloudflare offers some offerings like that. But do you need it? It depends on what your site is actually doing. So the first thing before you just start launching into one of these initiatives is we find ourselves having to counsel our own customers. You need to really think about why you want to do what you want to do. I really, really, really want to go out and buy myself an Audi A5. I want one so bad. But you know what? I have 2 young kids. That would be the dumbest thing in the whole world. Plus I can't afford one, but that's secondary. My kids can't fit in the car. So there's no reason for me to buy a car like that. The same thing when you're trying to fix your website, you have to make sure that it's going to fit your users. And I think that that's sort of one of these obvious things, but people miss it in their excitement to kind of get on the bandwagon for responsive design and to go in and actually fix all of the problems that plague their site. Now here's what I was talking about with time and CNN. The difference between a responsive site and a site that will load on a mobile device. Now think about 35% of users wanting to go to a full site regardless of the mobile options that you provide them, and then think about what their experience is actually going to be like. So we have customers tell us every day, my site loads fine on a mobile device. I see all this traffic coming in Google Analytics from a mobile device. So we start asking them, are those leads converting? How long are those users spending on your site? How many pages do they click through on your website? What are they actually experiencing when they come on? Now, this is one problem, okay? This is a navigation problem. It's a sort of context problem. Your art director's not going to be very happy if he actually took the time to look at something like this. But beyond it, your customer starts to think that they're being sent all over the world when they're watching your page load. You know, think about the problems that you have, for example, if your content's loading with JavaScript. Let's say that you tried to do one of the easy modifications to your website. You took all your JavaScript and you put it underneath the body of the page. Because you know that somebody said that that was a good optimization. I'm grossly exaggerating and being very coarse, right? But people say, take your JavaScript, take it out of the header, put it in the footer dump. That's an optimization in and of itself. Okay, great. I have images in my page that I have JavaScript tags associated with. Now my page loads. My JavaScript hasn't run yet. What happens next? I reflow the page. Users hate reflowing pages. You don't have to be a product manager and sit behind a bunch of users and watch what happens when a page reflows to get the faces and videotape their anger and everything else. It's obvious. When you're trying to read something on a page and you're chasing it, as the images above it are loading, that is horribly frustrating. Do that on a mobile device with a crappy network connection and a very small viewport, and also something that's touch sensitive and you're not sure if you're dragging or actually clicking on something, it makes for a horrible user experience. Now think about the way that you're tracking your users and what that tracking and the information and intelligence that you're trying to gather is doing to their experience. Think about Optimizely, Get Satisfaction, and all of the other sorts of third-party JavaScripts that you might be loading onto a site so that a user can give you feedback, or you can get some information in Marketo, or maybe they can open a live chat session with your users. They're not going to do those things first. That's something that they're going to do afterwards. So having that load in line with the rest of your page and having them waiting for that experience is not a very good way for you to load that site. So let's take Grammy.com as an example. The Grammys are young people, maybe you would say 18 to 45, let's say, is going to be their demographic, but they are a social site, right? The Grammys is, by definition, entertainment and social. And so, as you would expect, it's rife with third-party marketing and tracking tags. So if we go and look at it, I have a mouse, there it is. Grammy.com. So, it's very image heavy. I'm going to reload, I think. The site, is it reloading? Yeah. And we're going to scroll. There's a Facebook widget. There. Now, that's not a problem, really. It's a problem when any of us in the room or working at companies that run testing solutions try to benchmark the time that it takes your site to load. It took until that thing appeared for the site to load. But if I'm Joe User, that's pretty fast. So what they actually did was delay load the third-party widgets. That's a very effective optimization. The problem is when you actually go to test it and you use any solution out there that's doing synthetic monitoring of your website, you're going to assume that you have a horribly slow page. These guys have done a great job of optimizing their site, and if you actually go and view source on it, and I wasn't sure if I was going to have an internet connection, so I did it ahead of time, but you can see, not those Facebook links, but these, how they're loading their JavaScript for Facebook. So it actually makes sense that they're delaying it until the rest of the page loads. But if we look at what I wanted to talk about before, which was what happens if I have all my JavaScript at the bottom. I love that example, because it just makes it so obvious why it's so frustrating. So let's go to the bottom of the page and do it again. So you can just see there was JavaScript at the bottom of the page. It wasn't being run until after all the text had been loaded, and then it was going back in and it was filling in lazy loads of all the images. And if we look at what the code looks like, it's right here. So all of our images are getting loaded just like this, and then there's our content. And then if you go all the way to the bottom, you'll see that we have all of our other information for what they have for lazy load images down here. Now conversely, let's look at what happens if you try, to not right click, and then you just put in a placeholder instead for all of your images. So it might not be ideal that users are waiting for an image to load in the spot, but if I do find content that I want to read anywhere on the page, and I reload my page, or let's say I drop network and all of a sudden I come back online, I can keep reading exactly where I was, and I've got a placeholder for the image. And it's not actually something that's terribly difficult to implement. So if we look at the code in here, and what they actually did for it to work, they've got the lazy load images function in here, and where is, am I looking at the right one? Let's see. And we've got the lazy load images function, but then what they're also doing here is they're setting an image container. And that image container is the black box that they're setting to the right size of the images, and then they're just filling in the images with lazy loading afterwards. So for the end user experience, you're actually getting the same content that's being loaded, the same images. You haven't changed the images at all, but you've changed the experience significantly. And it's not a hell of a lot of really complicated code. Now, granted, we're running a service at Yoda where we want people to let us do this for them. And there's reasons for that, because when we look at some other sites, like for example this Bearpaw site, what they saw was really slow page rendering. So it was the same sort of a thing. It was content curation, it was a lot of thumbnail images so somebody could shop on the website. We wanted to improve their page load time, and as you can see here, is the original site is in green, and our site is here in orange. So there's a number of different things that we measure. Everybody measures sort of the life cycle of a page a little bit differently. We look at title changed, we call that time to title. Time to start render, time to fully interactive means time to interact, and then there's time to display, so it's mostly displayed. So mostly displayed, I think, is what most people actually care about, and that's what sets the user experience. It's nice when you get a title in your browser, but really most users, unless they're highly frustrated and waiting for a long time, won't really notice that, right? It's not the first thing that you look for. You're looking at the body of the page, not necessarily the title of your browser, unless you know you're on a really slow connection. So we don't do that faster than native, which we don't really care about. But when you look at when you find the actual content of the page and what's on it, let me show you a little video of the difference between, and I'll explain how we do this in a second, when we load the different images and what that actually looks like. So you can see all the images come in, and what we're doing is doing progressive rendering of the images, but we're done at 4.7 seconds. The thing here, so this is another example, by the way, of synthetic monitoring and some of the sort of false positives you can see. The majority of that page is loaded. As far as the user's concerned, if they're actually trying to figure out their, wannabe Ugg boots or whatever these things are that they're looking at, they'll see the images that they want. But they won't see all the content of the page. So for example, if you're going in and you just wanted to find the About Us section and scroll down to that in the footer, you wouldn't see it in as much time. But you will see the majority of the content. The problem is, what this doesn't necessarily show you in the video is that the page isn't actually, it's not possible to interact with the page, it's locked. So it's showing you the images, but the user can't click through on the image. And what they found was that users would go here after doing all of their shopping and evaluation. This actually started with the CTO's daughter who really wanted to buy a pair of these. And she found exactly what she wanted, and she was obsessing about it, and he didn't have much time, and he was trying to go to work that morning, and she said, "Daddy, just click through and buy them for me." And so he was standing there trying to rush out and trying to click on the boots and trying to click on the boots, and he couldn't click on the boots until they finally finished loading. And when the page was done after 20 seconds, he was able to go through. So they were a customer the same day because he came in and lost his patience. And there you go. So you can see the change in the amount of time. Now to explain what we actually did there, I want to jump back here for a second. We started picking our battles on the site. So if you look at the waterfall, but you also look at the timeline for a page loading, what are some of the things that you have to do? Well, you have to resolve DNS. If this is a problem for you, then you're not going to go around optimizing your images to overcome a DNS connectivity problem. Go take care of it with a DNS service. Don't spend the time on it. If you're having problems with your time to first byte, don't go out there and start trying to optimize your images, obviously. You might not even want to come to any sort of service like us. You might just want to say, my server infrastructure needs some work. Maybe. You can start drilling in a little bit more at this point. But if you look at the life cycle of your page and what you're actually impacting by handling these problems first, you're not going to move the needle very much. You may see a huge amount of variability here between different networks, different users, parts of the country, and whether people are on desktop or mobile. But it's still not going to be the 80% of the page load time that you really want to try to attack. Hopefully. If it's a huge bar, then yes, go out and figure out why that's a problem for you, but typically you're going to buy your way into a solution and not write your way into a solution. It's when the browser title bar appears all the way until the page is ready for interaction that you really have the most impact over. And there's a couple of things that people know how to do. So for example, you're going to compress your images. There's two types of compression that are popular. There's lossy and lossless compression. People, for the most part, know what those are. The tricks for getting compression right are basically to go as low quality as you can before people start to notice. So people starting to notice is sort of an amorphous thing. There's a website that I really, really love that all of our developers have basically gotten used to referencing as well. If I can remember where I put it, it's this one. And it's a great blog by Don Yopsis, and it talks about a common technique, which is to take an image, double it in size, and then seriously compress that image, and you'll end up with a resolution that is almost indiscernible from the original image, but it can be up to 75% lighter than the source image. So if you look left to right, you know, granted it's on a projector and it's a little bit washed out and everything else, but even if you were looking at this on your Retina display, MacBook Pro, or whatever you wanted, you would be hard-pressed to see material differences in these images. Now, these also are images where the girl happens to have a lot of freckles. You know, it is a little bit of a washed out picture, so you can't do this with everything to the exact same extent. But what you see is he's basically proving over and over again that this technique saves you a huge amount of space and a huge amount of bandwidth when you're transmitting enough of these images to enough of your users without a real discernible difference in the quality of the image. I'm sure, I'm curious how many people are familiar with that technique? Okay. Do you use it? No. Why?
So, I don't know, policy. So we actually discourage people from doing that because one of the downsides is you have to decode a much larger area of memory. Is oftentimes a problem, especially on lower end devices. So that's one reason. And two, you should be able to get the same results with just using a regular standard image. There's been plenty of studies, I think, lots of people have proven that when you actually do image comparisons, like SM comparisons in terms of visual quality, you can get the same results without doing this. So this is a hack. This is a neat hack. It's amazing that it works. Right? The first time I read it, I was like, this is a miracle. Yeah. Everybody should switch to this. But I think there's enough. There's got to be a better way to do this.
Yeah. So how about WebP? Do you guys have a feeling on WebP? Do you want to share? Because I tell you what, our guiding advice is, it's too early, don't go there. When we're talking to customers.
Facebook's doing it. So, you know.
We don't have Facebook's team though, and we don't have their money.
It has nothing to do with money team.
You don't think?
No, not at all.
So how do you get this?
They explain why they're doing it, right? Because they have so much images they have to send that they're saving, you know, terabytes of data they have to send over by they code everything with P.
Yep.
And if you can handle that, that's what they send you. If you can't, then they send you the regular stuff, right? So for them, they're at a big enough scale where, it makes a huge difference for them, you know. So, that's a real thing. And like you said, the other thing is a hack. That's not a hack. That's actually a format. Right?
It absolutely is.
That, you know, same images are smaller, right, with P than they are in JPEG or PNG, right? So.
And it handles transparency and you can press it. And so, I'm just curious, thoughts?
Yes. Please use it. I guess my question would be in reverse, but why do you think it's not ready?
What we see with so the people that come to us don't have necessarily the education or basically the skill on the team to do, for example, if you can't handle this format, then what do we serve you? How do we write that? Can we do it in an efficient way? Right. And so what we try to help them with is what's the easiest way to get you what you're looking to do, which is why in some cases the hack, if you can handle it and it's not adversely impacting your users or your sites from what we can tell from testing, might just work. If it's an easier way for you to get your product to market in with less money and a shorter amount of time, basically.
So, generally speaking, it's kind of just my own personal opinion with images, right? There's different formats, and we have content negotiation. You shouldn't have to change your market. You should just get the right image at the right size with the best format. So for example, stuff that we do in page speed is the text that, hey, this user coming on Chrome browser or this Opera browser supports WebP, so we'll send you a WebP. You don't have to modify your image, it's just a server. And you guys as a proxy can do this.
No, we can, yeah.
This is very simple now, especially with accept negotiation, right? You just look at the header and you say, I know this user supports it, I will serve a WebP. How do you implement that? So I totally agree with you. Like, if you tell me as a web developer that now please write conditional logic in my web page to load WebPs, JPEGs versus God knows what else. That's, I wouldn't advise anybody to do that. But if you can just automate it on the server, that could be a static build script, right? Grab my images, lay them out on disk, and just add some logic to serve directly from the server. All of this is doable. It requires a little bit of lower level fiddling. So, maybe it is a question of scale. Like, it depends how many images you're serving. Facebook, speaking of Facebook, just published a white paper with Ericsson, and they're serving WebPs to all of their Android traffic. And they're also extending it to iOS. They're saving about 20% bandwidth.
That's amazing.
We deployed, at Google, we're deploying WebP on a number of products. There's some that are public. We're saving terabytes of bandwidth on images. So, you're not going to get terabytes of bandwidth on your account.
And your average site. Well, I mean, so there's one thing, the conversations that we have about what we want to support in our network, and there's the other question about what we're asking our customers to do, right? So when you guys talk about a little bit of fiddling on the server, when we talk to people about minifying code sometimes, we're getting crossed eyes and raised eyebrows in meeting rooms and things like that. So I think one of the challenges that we've been facing and going around and talking to meetups, I'm hearing this a lot, is when you read the blogs and you're up on what's going on and you're actually in, trying the new technologies and you are a web developer who knows what you're doing, then talking about all these things makes perfect sense. But what we're finding in large and small companies, and surely the enterprises that have a lot of the, just basically legacy code and legacy mindset and everything else, it's not as trivial it shouldn't be that difficult to implement, and yet it is. Whether it's a conceptual problem or actually a knowledge problem of how to actually do it when they start, we're finding that people simply don't know how to do these things, simple or not.
Sure.
And so then, pushing, well, do something to give your users a better experience so you can get the conversions. Maybe you can buy the team or buy the person who's going to corral your team and actually get the education that you need, is part of the reason that I think at this early stage in the market, it almost makes, to us, more sense for people to use the hack that they know about, wait for the standards to emerge and the tools around them to be available, and then implement those things.
Yeah, so I think it's a tooling problem. I actually wouldn't quantify this as a simple problem. I think it's actually a very complex problem. Which format should I use with which compression settings? That's very hard. And I think this is where automation has to come in.
Yeah.
But I think it has nothing to do with technology. Roll the clock back 10 years ago, we were having the same conversation with P&G came up. Right. And I think it really has nothing to do with the tech. I mean, P&G is a gorgeous format for what I married it. But the problem with it is, the issue with P&G is it becoming a standard, which took forever for the routers to kind of get it all working together. And even then, if from a pipeline of getting creative to cut it in those formats, if you go to a retailer who's got 1,200 images, 1,200 products, and now you have to say, oh, by the way, not only you have to cut a WebP format, a JPEG compression, by the way, you've got a couple of JS changes, the landscape, let alone, I don't even know if Photoshop even saves as WebP.
Right, and you shouldn't have to do any of that. Right, so this is what I mean by automation. You should, as a designer, just spit out like your highest fidelity image, probably at the highest resolution, whatever, 10x, no DPI, DPR, and then the server should just resize it correctly. And there's a variety of image hosting services now, like CDN Connect and others, which allow you to do just that. You just upload a high-res image, they will take that in, they will convert it to either JPEG or WebP through the server.
But I agree that it actually has to do with scale, because especially for small, medium businesses, buying, we've had conversations with retailers who are buying a CDN, go, please buy a CDN, go get a CDN, deliver it to your house, and have it in your bed too, is a huge, big thing. It really has been, it becomes a standard, and it is, I think, a conversation with all of us in the room to promote the standard. We become the evangelists for the standard, and we become the evangelists to say, we really do mean it. That it becomes sort of a, common place to say, of course, it's just a living form.
So, I agree, there's still a lot of kinks to work out, but, we've invested a lot in this tool. There's stuff like Basecamp, which will do all of this for you, which will resize the images, convert the formats on the fly. There are third-party services that do this, turnkey services that you just upload images to, they'll do this for you. But, still, it requires a bit of work.
Yeah, I did put some of the tools up here. So, one of the things that we talk to customers about quite frequently is, when should you do your optimizations, for example? And part of this is what you're talking about right now. Do you do it at development time? Do you do it at deployment time? Or do you do it at delivery? What we do is delivery. When the user has a website and they put it on Yoda, we actually take it at delivery time and we have code that does a number of different things. We have client-server communication that looks at the user's interaction on the page, the network that they're running on, the device, the viewport size, etc. It's similar to what a lot of us in the space are doing. And then we'll take their content and we'll give them the right kind of content depending on who they're visiting and what situation they're visiting. So for example, if I'm coming to your website from iPhone 4, then I know that I'm going to have a certain viewport size. I don't have RWD images. I'm probably coming on a Verizon or AT&T network, but we can see all of those types of things. And then it's up to us, not necessarily the web developer, to deliver the right content in the right way. So we do right sizing of images. We do image resizing on the server. We do content delivery where we'll deliver a page that's comprised of static and dynamic elements, and we'll actually serve you the cached version of your HTML and then fill in the dynamic elements from the server. So we'll give you the placeholder image and then we'll revert the part of the image or the part of the page that should be dynamic. So like, for example, the shopping cart that has your name in it, the personalized ads, the web tracking beacons, all the other things that you need to get that have specific relevance to an individual, we'll get from the server, but you don't have to sit around waiting for that in order to accept your page on your device. But there are optimizations at deploy time. So I mentioned a couple of them here. Grunt responsive images, for example, image magic when you're using Node or Express. For PNGs, there's a number of them that I listed here. Script PNG, Image Alpha, Image Optim. Google actually has some pretty good videos and tools to explain how you can compress images, how you can understand the quality of the image, and when you've gotten to a point where you're actually losing quality, maybe you can't see it, but they can help you with some of that guidance. So it's true that there are tools out there. The problem is, for a lot of people, what we're finding, because of the amount of time that they have or don't to spend on this, because of the resources that they have in development, and because of their focus as a company, if it's not push button, they're basically just kind of pushing it all aside. And so what we're trying to do with our solution, and a lot of other companies are too, is to give you all of that in a push button solution. There's some other tools that I figured I'd mention. Given that it's this group, you guys have probably heard of or used all of these before. But I am curious, Ringmark, other than, you definitely know what it is, but has anybody here actually used it in practice? Do you guys use it? Do you benchmark Chrome against it at all? No?
Sure.
I've never heard of it.
Oh, you haven't heard of it? So this was something that I actually got a kick out of. The Dolphin browser is the one browser that will actually pass Ring 1. But basically, at every ring of this system, it's going out to test the capabilities of the browser to see what it can actually support. And so if you have your code that you've written for your website that has, for example, a bunch of CSS commands, then you run Ringmark, for example, on the browser and the device that you want it to run. You want your site to run, it'll tell you if you'll be able to use basically all of those methods. And at every ring, it has more and more. So Ring 0 is basically the state of the internet today. It's any form-based website. Anybody who's written anything in HTML5 basically today is basically counting on Ring 0 to work in their browser. Ring 1 starts to get you a little bit more interactive, more device operations, and then Ring 2 is more gaming, 3D imagery, things of that nature. There's a lot of documentation on this. It's open source code. It's freely available on GitHub. Well, there's a full list of supported features link there, but if you look for Ringmark, or you ever actually just go to rng.io on your phone, you can see it. It'll run a test in your mobile browser, and you can see how many rings you pass. Modernizer. Anybody here use or heard of Modernizer? Fantastic. You guys already know what that does. For the sake of anybody who doesn't know, if you're working on something in HTML5 and CSS and it's not supported on certain legacy browsers, then Modernizer can help you create polyfills so that you can have the same sort of effect on a legacy browser that doesn't support what you're writing. There's a function that's actually, if I'm not mistaken, a subset of the Modernizer code that's just basically has JS, and you can run it to see if the browser has support for what you're trying to write or not. And then there's some useful links here. This one, I believe, is GitHub. I don't remember if I changed the bit.ly from a GitHub link. I think it is, but that's actually the name of the page. Writing cross-browser JavaScript Polyfills. This is a good tutorial to read. And then Ultimate Guide to Mobile Emulators and Simulators, just in case you're writing native code. There's one other thing that is very amorphous. There are some companies like Marlin who are trying to tackle this, or at least give people some insight into some of the problems that can arise here. But it's what happens with mobile devices and network connectivity in the different mobile networks. And Arrow from AT&T is one of those. Doug Sillers is the guy who's evangelizing about it. Some of you guys I know have met and spoken with him. But this is a product that can help you understand as a developer what happens on the user's device when you write your code, when your code is actually running. So for example, how often do you activate the radio? What does it do to your battery life? How is the device performing when you have certain numbers of bars? It can do a lot of simulations for you. It can give you a lot more granular information about how either wasteful or not your application is in certain scenarios. He's got some case studies that are fantastic. If you look up ARO from AT&T online, and he's got some great case studies from customers, and he's constantly updating what he has available. But people are seeing gains of 60, 70% load time improvements just by changing the amount of round trips that they do, or taking the connections back to their servers and combining them together. So if you've got one connection for your content, one connection for your analytics, and another round trip, let's say for gosh, I don't know, going out and downloading more script from your servers, if you combine all of those operations into a single open connection and closed connection, then what he's showing is the amount of bandwidth that you can save and also the amount of battery life that you can save. So I'm going to do a little tiny bit on Yoda, and then I'm going to stop. But what I've been mentioning about us being sort of a push-button end-to-end solution, there's all sorts of things that get in the way of delivering an application to a user. There are server-side problems, there's the code that you write, there's the server infrastructure that you run it on. There's your geographic presence and middle-mile delivery of your content. And Akamai and a lot of CDN solutions are self-included are there to help you with, basically caching things at the edge of the internet that's closest to your users so they can get the best possible delivery of static content. There's last-mile network presence optimizations. For last mile, it's going to be, a lot of the things that are impacting mobile. It's going to be the number of bars, the shakiness or the stability of the network that you're connected to, and whether you've got a solution or just code that doesn't exacerbate problems when you're going across the last mile. This is why all the round trips can be so problematic on mobile. There's front end with device and browser presence, and I'll talk to you about a little bit about what we do with all of these, and then there's the end user. So what we try to do here is have server-side code and JavaScript that we can inject into your front-end client code that basically communicate with each other. And we can do all sorts of things on the page. We can take your third-party JavaScript tags and we can decide when those will load. Will they load on demand? Will they delay load after a certain amount of time? Will they load in line with a user event like scrolling or some sort of page event, like a timing event or an on-click event or an on-load event? We can also transform the content of your page. So if we see, for example, that your user agent is coming from an iDevice and you have Flash movies, we can decide to replace those with a static image. You don't have to write the code. We set up the rule in our service and we can replace that for you. We can set up the right image processing and the right image compression and deliver the right size and the right size from a resolution perspective and the right size from a weight perspective to your end users. And then the last thing that we actually work on doing is transforming elements of your page so that we can say if you've got, for example, an entire content block on your page that you want to transform in certain scenarios to be different. So if I have, for example, a user coming in on a desktop from the United States, they're going to be allowed to, and I'm going to want to present them with certain things, whereas if they're coming from China, I may want to translate that into, or transform it into something else. Maybe the national laws regulate that I do something differently, or maybe I just want to, for my demographic, do things a little bit differently. We do fill in the blanks with some of these other things, so there's a monitoring component to what we do that gives you visibility and testing. We actually use WPT, so for anybody that's using web page test, our service is built around web page test, like a lot of the testing services are. We offer desktop and mobile simulations, a CDN federation, and a cloud firewall service. So that's a little bit just about Yoda. I don't want to belabor the point. If you have questions, I'm more than happy to talk to you about Yoda, and I'll take any questions if you have them. Yeah?
Not about Yoda, so...
Yeah.
So Vicky, I work with Akamai, and I also work in Android. So I was hoping, is there a study or systematic study done around that? What's the problem with the browser and the operating system framework, which causes mobile sites not to work so good? So we know there is a problem with the content that's delivered. Could be you're giving a retina image where you don't need it, but once the packets are delivered on the device, is there a system, like, do we need any improvements on the browser's capability itself or the framework? Or, let's say, like, the browser does a lot of support for the native apps. Not the browser, the phone that gives a lot of support for the native apps. Is there a possibility to get support from the phone or the browser to do a lot of stuff so that you don't have to, let's say, transfer a 1 kilobyte JavaScript every time you want to load a page? There is something natively in there so that you would just...
I might ask the guys flanking you that question. I honestly have no idea.
I'm not sure, I mean,
I don't understand that.
Yeah.
The browser gives you a lot of stuff if you're programming for the web delivery. Getting your stuff to the phone is a fairly large challenge, particularly in mobile with the round trip times in particular. Guy behind you just wrote a book on it. But there's, I mean, the round trips, it's a lot of work. You have to know how your site is being delivered to a mobile device to be able to get it to load quickly. Whereas with an app, they're downloading all of the content beforehand, right? And then, or they're downloading the app and the framework beforehand, and then just fetching content on the fly. Usually with a mobile website, you're delivering the app and the content all at the same time and trying to do it efficiently.
So could the browser phone provide a lot that's needed for a web page so that they don't have to send it across?
So it's there,
Like,
depending on what you're trying to do. If you're not including a whole lot of extra third-party stuff, then like Optimizely, which is an A/B testing platform which blocks the renderer and everything else. If you're actually delivering the HTML that describes your page, you can inline the images even, and in like the first 10, 15K of the data you send, you can deliver everything that needs to display a useful page if you program for it. If on the other hand you use a template that you bought off of the web somewhere for like WordPress or whatever, that loads 10 different JavaScript libraries and 4 different themes and isn't actually programmed and designed specifically for that experience, you start to run into problems, right? Because it starts having to make all of those round trips.
Well, I think it's also you need to learn landscape. What's going out there? What's the difference between all the carriers? What's the difference between all the OSs? This is the challenge. We're the guys at Marvel. So, and we talk about this is the challenge that we took on, is to give insight into that world. So that part of, I'm a big believer that, and you know, whether you guys believe me or not, is stop the madness of optimizing at the end and actually begin to sort of create your optimizations at the beginning of the design of the experience so that we give our users and our customers an insight to say, look at the landscape before you jump in, before you buy this, before you buy all of these things, and you're interested to build an experience, is create a benchmark for yourself, create an actual understanding of the different carriers and the different devices, and then actually use that to create the foundation of your user experience and what's it going to be. You're not going to send, you know, 2 megabyte files at cheap Kyocera events on Virgin Mobile. But if your customer base and you know who your customers are and who you're targeting, you can actually create a profile for yourself and say, I'm going to build an experience around these issues. And what carriers, what locations. I'll tell you right now, there is, you know, a huge disparity. Like 3 years ago when we started, people were like, you guys are crazy. Like, you know, everyone has an iPhone, there's only a handful of iPhones, and you know, we're all good. And now, you know, Android is 80% of the global market. Let me tell you that, you know, that fragmentation is all over the place. And part of it is, one of the things that we're able to measure is that there is a 9x difference from the fastest Android to the slowest Android. And there's even a difference in OS. There's even like a 25% difference between going from 2 to 3 and then to 4. And so if you know that your experience is going to be building your profile based on your user base, you want to really design around not only who you have the users you're going to get. So we'd love to talk more about what we do and sort of give you guys a little bit of insight and even share some of our data in terms of what makes mobile unique. I think we've all gotten pretty complacent that we love our mobile web experiences, and especially our mobile experiences. Man, I was just laughing with them that when I heard a mobile desktop site that was 2 megabytes downloaded. And this is from a retailer everyone has probably bought stuff from. And it was like, holy cow, the tablet is sucking this down? And not only that, we were laughing at more that they did base 64 on their fonts using font base. I was like, are they high on crack? But that's, what we tell our customers. If you're not mobile, you're mobile. Your customers are opening up your tablet and opening it up on your experience. It's time to optimize. It's time to sort of know the landscape. You need to know what the playing field is before you jump in and start optimizing and changing things. And you might realize you're not doing the same thing.
So on the Chrome side, right, I think your question is very broad. The browser is evolving. We're continuously adding new features. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Modernizer, right? We're actually building APIs, native APIs in the browser. There's CSS at supports rule now, which basically allows you to eliminate modernizer. They don't give you all of the same checks necessarily, and this has just landed. It's very recent, so you probably can't use it in production yet, but it's there with the intent of that's one less JavaScript, blocking JavaScript that you don't have in your page. Right? Same thing for web fonts. We know that web fonts are exploding in terms of popularity and use. There's a popular web font loader, which was built by Typekit and Google team. That API is also landing with CSS, and we're implementing it now. Right? So now we have these native widgets or APIs that can do that functionality, which will make things a lot faster. Those are just 2 examples. Right? There's plenty of work. The trouble is always it takes time for that stuff to ship, to make it to the older browsers. So, it's one thing for me to stand up and say, like, look at all these amazing APIs, and you can, like, if you target the latest Chrome, you're going to have a blast of a time building a fast page. But then the reality sets in and you say, well, I got to support, my IE something. I'm not picking an IE, right? Actually, I am, but I got to support my IE users, right? And at that point, it's kind of like, well, then it's complicated.
And it's hard if you're evolving a desktop site and trying to adapt that for mobile, it's a lot harder than building a mobile experience from the ground up. Because mobile, it's a lot different, but you also have a lot of modern stuff that's already there. Even just going back to iOS and Android 2.3, for example, you don't have to do a lot of the fallbacks that you have to do if the same code also has to support IE6 and Firefox and God knows whatever else. So
that's a great point, actually. And mobile is somewhat similar, right? Because you basically have 2 platforms. There's iOS and Android. And there's fragmentation within there, like Android browser and all the rest. But it's actually much more consistent than desktop. So actually make it so easier.
I actually think mobile browser is less forgiving. You could get away, try going to your desktop browser and don't close HTML code, it'll actually do it for you. And then do the same thing on a mobile browser, it'll actually break it. I actually think mobile is really, really less forgiving. You could get away with, and the reason is that the mobile browser is still really young. I know that you guys are doing a pile of improvements, but if you look at the disparity of all the different browsers, the people who are going to get Chrome on Android 4.3 and above, they are going to get a completely different experience than the Garmin phone running 1.6 that still has the original WebKit browser, or my Samsung Captivate that I still play with that's running 2.1 and still has sort of a version of the browser that you can use to share.
So I'm not sure about the actual HTML markup. Certainly, that's the story with WebKit, right? Like for once, we've actually converged on something that works. And I haven't seen a problem with that. Like we actually, our Chrome mobile uses the same stack of parsing one as your desktop. There's a few optimizations and disable things, but it's the same code. So you should, if you're running into bugs like that, then let us know.
Yeah, I've never seen that. I've never seen that either.
Yeah.
It's the same browser, it's the same engine, right? So it wouldn't break on one thing and not break on something else. That is
Yeah, but even like there's different places. Well, so
No, I know.
there are different flavors, and I take a look at like, yes, Safari is based on WebKit, so is, the Android browser, but certain things are slightly different, and caches are different, and pipeline connections are different, and concurrent connections are different, so they are slightly unique.
Yeah, I'm not saying they're all the same, sure.
No, it is, but it's something that I think makes it harder. I mean, when programming for the web, it's like, we all know, it's like, hey, look, it looks good on Chrome, it's going to look great on Safari, and then there's, well, that thing called Firefox, and we'll deal with that later, and then there's IE. But in terms of, like, what to worry about, like, I don't worry when I build things for the web anymore. I mean, I'm pretty confident that that experience will work. Yeah, sure, I don't know what's functional design, what makes this thing up, but I worry when we get, when we get to mobile.
I think to add to, like, part of your question was after, like, everything was downloaded on mobile, like, web browser, there's still probably sometimes a noticeable performance decrease in a web app versus a native app, and I think a lot of that is just because of how it has to be interpreted. Like, your JavaScript, CSS, HTML, all has to be interpreted before it's actually rendered. So a native app is compiled, and also the operating system is giving the native apps a lot of those resources at a much lower level, so it renders and scrolls much faster. So that's probably part of that performance. But yeah, 95% has been natural.
Talking about native, I have one more question. So is NSCL making the native plan support in the browser, making any gateway to e-commerce? I know the gamers are using it, but does that help anything on the performance? Because where you say rather C++ code in the browser rather than JavaScript, has anybody tried to do that stupid yet?
No. So I don't think Apple works on mobile. I don't think so. So in Chrome we have an app.
Would be sensitive e-commerce on that? No, right?
I'm not even sure what you would like.
Just
Actually, there's a function in the sequels, but like I'm not sure you have much like gamers usually.
Yeah.
The pitch there is you have an existing SQL code base. You can just run it directly in the phone.
Okay.
Right, so that's for games and such.
Not doing an integration, just
But your typical e-commerce app is not CPU bound.
That's right, yeah, it's not a CPU issue. You still get half the native apps on the Apple store are just native wrappers on a web view, right?
Right.
So they're not doing anything special, right? They're just rendering, you put something out of like, phone gap, something like that, you're just wrapping a web app inside of a native wrapper, right? So you're not getting any special, differences. Like you said, it's not a CPU issue, right? The other thing too that he highlighted is that people are just doing bad development practices. That's really what this mitigates people doing bad development practices, right? In my opinion, where, if you don't have any, almost everything now should be some kind of like, you use Yeoman, you should have boilerplate, use all these things, right? They have these scripts that optimize images for you. They have the stuff that minifies the stuff for you. If people in enterprises can't do that, that's a different issue, right? Because that's just bad development technique, right? People have so much images, you can just batch convert that to anything you want. It's not like a huge, it would take you like 5 minutes. I mean, I don't understand what the big thing is, right? There's dozens of utilities that would just do that, right? So either it's like incompetence, it's laziness, or whatever it is, but a lot of stuff is mitigated just by just using quote unquote best practices for how you do some of this stuff. Yes, you have to keep up. You have to keep, going to conferences. You have to keep reading blog posts. You have to keep buying the latest books. You have to keep, keeping up to date with these techniques. But that's just sort of like how it goes, right? I mean, because the web is very different today than it was 2 years ago. And how you do certain things, I mean, even WordPress now has a CDN anybody can use, right, on their own blog. I mean, it's not like for free, right? So it's not like that's like, even that's become less of a thing, right? So, I don't know.
Well, I think one of the issues there, so for example at Etsy, we've been interested in implementing Speedy, right? But we have almost all of our static assets on our CDNs, and our hit rate is extremely high. And the CDNs used today don't support Speedy. So we can't turn Speedy on. If you could turn on Origin, it's like 5% of our traffic or less. So that's in a situation where we need to talk to CDN vendors and get them to implement this stuff. So it's not as simple as just like doing the best practices internally. It might not make a difference for us, unfortunately.
And speaking for a very nascent CDN vendor compared to you guys, our customers aren't using it, our customers don't want to use it, and so when you ask us where we're going to put our money, it's not going to be in supporting Speedy in the near future. We all want to, the CTO is dying to do it, but we can't.
And right, so like Speedy and HTTP 2.0 are like one of the least controversial improvements that's coming down the pipe, right? Like everybody is all for it. It's like full speed ahead, but it's still, support is still not there on big properties, big